Jack Cole was born in 1914 in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, the third of 6 children. He exhibited an early facility for drawing in childhood, but other than briefly taking a correspondence course in his teens, he was entirely self-taught. In order to make a living, Cole took a job with the American Can Company, and in 1934, when he was 19, he met and subsequently married Dorothy Mahoney. In 1936, he and his wife relocated to Greenwich Village in New York City, and in that year he had a rather unpromising cartoon published in Judge magazine, and a couple of others in Boy's Life. But this was at least a tentative step in the right direction, and in the following years both these publications continued to feature his work. His appearances in Judge were not many, but he actually became quite a frequent contributor to Boy's Life, and it was with this cartoon work that he got his start as an illustrator. In 1938, Circus the Comic Riot was launched, which featured some strip work by Cole, but it failed to find an audience and was abandoned after only 3 issues. And in that year he was among others who created comic art for Star Comics, which only lasted a little better with 9 issues. Nevertheless, despite these setbacks, he was by this point also drawing comic strip pages for Screwball Comics, with various short-lived but madcap character creations. For reasons I don't know and can't imagine, Cole was working at this time under a number of aliases, including George Nagel and Ralph Johns. But with his regular strip work and more monochrome gag cartoons for Boy's Life magazine, he was by now at least earning a living, if only just as a freelancer. But as the 1930s came to an end, his appearances became far more frequent, and alongside his by now expected brightly coloured manic strips featuring an apparently bottomless reserve of weird and wonderful characters, he also began creating more poker-faced detective features intended more to excite than amuse the reader. In these strips, visual humour was completely absent, and although, like other comics of the day, the pages and frames were laid out uniformly, these strips had a hard-bitten, racy narrative appeal. In 1939, he was hired as an editor at Silver Streak Comics, and in that role he was charged with restyling the recently created superhero character Daredevil, manifestly not the same one as later created for Marvel. And under Cole's guidance, the character was reimagined with more visual energy than previous incarnations. Among other superhero characters worked on at this time was the Comet, but his association was only brief before being taken over by others. He was particularly prolific at this time and worked for any number of different publishers, and in 1940 he was hired as an assistant to Will Eisner to help keep up with the workload demanded by his immensely successful strip The Spirit. And when Eisner went off to fight in the Second World War, Cole and Lou Fine kept the strip going in his absence. Simultaneously, Cole also created a couple of humorous press ads promoting the drink King Cola, but advertising work was never really on his agenda. Most significantly for his career, it was also in 1941 that what would be Cole's own greatest success, Plastic Man, was launched as one of several superhero characters in Police Comics. And such was the level of his popularity with the readers, Plastic Man became the lead feature in issue 5 of the comic. The narratives and dialogue, which were all written by Cole, were distinguished by a generous amount of offbeat comedy not usually seen in superhero comics. And the very nature of this particular hero's powers of distortion and apparently infinite elasticity produced some particularly dynamic page composition and highly unusual and frequently surreal images which were always manic in nature. In addition to devising and writing the storylines, Cole also inked the lettering and panels with a very precise, well-controlled brush and pen technique. His approach to anatomy in this comic creation had made some concessions to the small head, big-chested formula used for all superheroes, but his earlier more cartoon-based styling persisted in many of the supporting characters. including Plastic Man's somewhat bizarre and improbable sidekick Woozy Winks. Like other comics of the period, the layout of the frames was fairly pedestrian and functional, and Cole's work for comics, just like that of all his contemporaries working in the genre, was created as black and white in pen or brush and ink, but was printed with added solid and dot screen colour, most frequently not applied by the artists themselves. It was nevertheless a demanding process, at least if it was skillfully done, and each separate colour had to be produced as black overlays with a colour assigned to each print run. Consequently, colour registration was variable at best and relied heavily on the black line to conceal potential inaccuracies. By 1943, Plastic Man had become popular enough to warrant his own comic and was competing successfully with the many others which by now were proliferating in the USA and were voraciously consumed by American teens. He was still ghosting the Spirit strip, and there were a few other excursions, including this cartoon making fun of Hitler and a comic featuring him again, this time in the company of his arch-villain buddies. But Plastic Man consumed by far the majority of Cole's output from this point on. As a superhero character, Plastic Man stood apart from others due to the inherently comical nature of his powers. The mere sight of him bent and stretched into all manner of preposterous shapes was inevitably going to be humorous. Despite his ongoing commitment to Plastic Man, following Will Eisner's return from the war to resume work on the Spirit, Cole created his own conspicuously similar character known as Midnight for Smash Comics. The debt this strip owed to Eisner was glaringly obvious, and some might say bordered on copyright infringement. But it simply couldn't match Eisner's creation either graphically or narratively, and presented no competitive challenge to the rightly iconic Spirit. But Midnight's failure to engage didn't much matter considering the enduring popular success of Plastic Man. And for the next few years, Cole continued to be prolific and relentlessly imaginative in the scenarios and narratives he created. Additionally, Cole collaborated with the writer Joe Millard to create the light-hearted feature The Barker, starring Carnival Barker Carney Callahan and his sideshow sidekicks. And although this too couldn't match the success of Plastic Man, it nevertheless ran for 5 years from 1944 onwards. By 1945, the jokes he was having published in Judge and other magazines such as Humour Armour, where he used the alias Jake, had taken a decidedly more sophisticated turn in their graphic expression. He was now using tonal washes, and his line work was considerably more expressive, and however caricatured, far more anatomically plausible than his earlier attempts. Although Plastic Man continued to be popular in the post-war years, the strip was increasingly being delegated to other writers and artists, even though it continued to be credited only to Cole. The impact of this farming out of the content was at first fairly imperceptible, but as Cole himself withdrew from the relentless demands of his successful creation, the comic inevitably lost some of the appeal that had made it popular in the first place. Nevertheless, only the hardcore fans of the series would have been able to tell the difference, other than perhaps in the quality of the writing. Cole did briefly return to its production in 1949 and 1950, but the strip would never equal its success of the early 1940s. With his commitment to Plastic Man no longer part of his workload, in the early 1950s, Cole made significant contributions to the horror comic Web of Evil, which, as the name suggests, specialised in gory tales well suited to the gleefully grotesque aspects of Cole's images. But the magazine only lasted for 2 years between 1952 and 1954 and was outclassed by rivals including Tales from the Crypt and Tales of Terror. When psychiatrist and arch-Puritan Dr. Frederick Wortham began his crusade against violent comic books with the publication of his 1954 book Seduction of the Innocent, Cole's story Murder, Morphine and Me, published in True Crime Comics in 1947, was quoted as a prime example of the degeneracy of these comics. Outside of his work for comics, Cole had increasingly been creating sexually suggestive cartoons for several humour magazines, and these were all created in what had become, in this context at least, a trademark loose but expressive line and wash approach, most frequently published in monochrome halftone. But in 1954 he was given the opportunity to work almost exclusively in full colour when he became a regular contributor to Hugh Hefner's newly launched men's magazine Playboy. He first appeared in the 5th issue of Playboy and quickly became a permanent fixture in the magazine. Playboy was of course an immense success, at least with half the population of the USA, and its phenomenal popularity meant that the jokes Cole was now creating was seen and laughed at by a very large audience across the nation, and even in Europe and elsewhere when its success became global. The illustrations Cole created for his own captioned humour were particularly brightly coloured, and although line work remained at the foundation of these paintings, it was only minimally evident in the final image, creating the illusion that they had just somehow been magically splashed onto the page. The pneumatic females he created and the hapless males, who were almost invariably the butt of the joke, were conceived using an exaggerated anatomic style, which nevertheless had considerable plausibility. And like the best cartoon work, as seen in that of his contemporary at Playboy, Jack Davis and others, his risque, good-natured images somehow seem more real than mere reality. Although it was now cartoons such as these that dominated his output, he didn't give up on comic strip work, and in 1955 he created the surprisingly sedate Millie and Terry for American Armed Forces Features. But it managed a run of only 9 instalments. In 1956, Plastic Man came to the end of its 15-year run, although it had been several years since Cole had had anything to do with the ongoing saga of the character he had created in 1941. And nothing if not tenacious, even as he continued to produce yet more suggestive gags for Playboy and other magazines, he returned to comics again in 1958. But this time the work he created was completely unrecognisable from anything else he had worked on to date. This was the simple but graphically charming daily strip Betsy and Me, another surprisingly mild-mannered but endearing series which he both wrote and illustrated. The large-headed characters were more like those of Schultz's Peanuts, and the whole strip was drawn with a simple, bold but surprisingly descriptive line with areas picked out in solid black. Betsy and Me was widely syndicated, and the strip showed all the promise of a long and widely published newspaper strip with potentially international appeal. But he had only been working on it for a couple of months when out of the blue Jack Cole committed suicide at the age of only 43. Sadly, Cole isn't the first illustrator I've featured on the channel who took his own life, and he's unlikely to be the last. Naturally enough, there is some speculation in comic book circles about the reason or reasons for Cole's suicide, from serious domestic problems with his wife through to him owing Hefner money. But there's nothing conclusive, and it's better left that way in my opinion. Whatever his motivation was, it's a great pity that his life and career were over so soon, and particularly as it seemed to have been on an upward trajectory. Unfortunately, we can only speculate where his obvious creative energy and imagination might have led him in later life. But rather than dwell on this depressing fact, I hope you'll join me instead in celebrating the astonishing and astonishingly diverse body of work he did create. Plastic Man remains his most well-regarded legacy, and it was undoubtedly one of the most distinctive and cheerfully absurd of the superhero genre. But there is plenty of entertainment to be had from his other work, and particularly the later cartoons. And here to draw this tribute to its conclusion is a mixed bag of more work by Cole not previously featured in the video.